What this taught us, and I think from a very, very high level, what I take away from this process is really this very basic structure for how to run an in silico clinical trial. And I'm going to go through this. I'm going to use this kind of as a framework for describing what we did. And I think it's a useful framework for everybody to kind of think about the components that are needed for something like this. Particularly in this example, I think there's well, in general with in silico clinical trials, there's many different classifications for them. There's everything from the orthopedic space, which we've seen a few examples of, up to the cardio space, where you really need to incorporate systems, including the cardiovascular flow throughout the body, and the fact that the device is going to change some of those systemic factors. And those examples, there's still these basic components, but we'll talk about kind of what goes into them. And just to kind of walk through this real quickly, on the left, we have something, just a device model. So in our case, we're thinking about, obviously, the tier example of a device implementation. We use that device model. We also have virtual patients is the language that we use. So essentially digital twins, but the idea being that they're not necessarily representative of the individual patient. Instead, they're virtual patients. So they could be synthetic or what have you. So you create a model that you're able to change, and maybe it's statistical shape modeling, maybe it's some other method parameterization that allows you to create what we call a virtual patient cohort. So now we're trying to use the language of clinical trials, where you have a group of patients that are all represented virtually by whatever your model is. Then you can include the device into that virtual patient, and you have some acute performance. So that's all really good. So hopefully in our scenario, we get to see a reduction in mitral regurgitation, and we can talk about what that might look like in our example again. But ideally, in the key point here is that you have some acute performance index. So what have you done in the surgery itself, in the procedure itself, to change in the short term, whatever the condition is? Now, that's great. But if you know anything about clinical trials, you're familiar with the fact that in many cases, particularly in cardiovascular worlds, it's not the acute performance that matters, although that is important, particularly from a safety perspective. It's also the sort of more longitudinal endpoints that are critical. So how do we get from understanding what happens as part of the procedure to what's going to happen down the road? Maybe it's 60 days, maybe it's 30 days, maybe it's 2 years. And maybe some of those clinical endpoints are not exactly related to that valve, but maybe they're actually related to quality of life. So all of these things, we got to be able to go from acute performance down to those predicted clinical endpoints. So that, in fact, I think is the hardest part, because all the folks in this room probably are familiar with modeling and comfortable with the idea of doing some modeling, but getting from that acute performance down to the clinical side of things, where the doctors care, is quite a challenge for some of these guys.